everybody, and welcome again to our channel, Renewables in Africa platform, where we're actually talking to very interesting people. And then a few days ago, I attended the Africa Energy in Daba, and I was kind of really frustrated. Why? Because there was two key interviews I could not do on that day, because I'm talking about two gentlemen that were very busy. But we're fortunate enough to arrange something else for you today, especially for the Renewables in Africa audience. So I want to talk today with Kesh Mudaly and Rudy van Blerk from BCG Consulting. I'm not going to tell you more about them because they will have the pleasure to do so by themselves. So if I start with you, Kesh, if you can maybe introduce yourself succinctly, and Rudy as well will do the same. And I'd like us, if that's okay with you, just to go through a set of questions that I believe people will find very, very interesting.
Yeah, happy to do that, Tony. Thanks for the intro. So yeah, very happy to be here. My name is Kesh Mudaly. So I'm a principal here in the Johannesburg office of BCG, focused on energy, climate, sustainability. I also lead the topic for green hydrogen in Africa for BCG. And for the last 3 years, I've been working quite closely with our partners, the NBI, in defining what a just transition could look like for the country towards net zero, which is referred to as the climate pathways and just transition work. So yeah, that's really the core of my experience, and I think looking forward to the conversation.
Great, and hi Tony, thanks so much for having us on your program. So I'm Rudy van Blerk. I'm a partner from BCG based in our Johannesburg office, and I focus on both the energy and the mining industries, especially on climate and sustainability and people-related topics. So I've been supporting a lot of South Africa's big companies on some of the more challenging topics in the space, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today.
Excellent, that's fine. One of the reasons I was very interested talking to you guys, I know BCG very well, so you're a big name out there, so you're always coming up with very interesting insights, and that's why I thought having you today would be really beneficial. I want to start with you, Rudy, if that's okay. So sure. I'm just wondering, because I know we're all talking about the energy crisis that the continent is facing. A lot of the time, people will mention about the amount of people that are lacking energy, which is true. We all know that. But I want to focus more about the business side of it. So can you tell me more about, according to you, what is the impact that the energy crisis is having on African business? And that would be good if you can give me maybe a couple of facts that are telling so that we can fully understand what you're talking about.
Sure. And Tony, I mean, you're right to say that a lot of people focus on the number of people, right? Because it is such a big number. And in Africa, we have 600 million people who don't have access to reliable electricity. But if you think about what that means for business, and Kesh, feel free to also come in here, but this results in a lot of basically hidden demand, where because of the lack of access to electricity, there are products and services that consumers would like to use that they're just not able to use, right? If you think of a very basic example, right, like even a fridge, not having access to electricity means you're not able to purchase that, and affects a lot of industry downstream. So yeah, so it results in a lot of latent demand that's sitting there that can't result in business otherwise. And on top of that, it affects, of course, companies' ability to serve their customers reliably and consistently when they require electricity in their processes. So it affects manufacturing, affects small businesses, etc. So I think the impact is truly massive, and the potential to revitalize and expand Africa's economies, if this latent demand is met, is huge.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I don't know, Kesh, you want to jump into that, but I'd be keen to hear from you as well on this question.
Yeah, I think Rudy outlined it really well. Maybe one interesting perspective that I think we see as well is that, you know, no company is really immune to this, right? You may assume that some of the big industrials have their own self-generation and, you know, can be a bit protected against some of the energy security issues we see across the continent. But actually, think about the integrated nature of business. Think about the SMMEs that are supplying goods into these big industrial companies, and the complexity of the movements both inbound to those plants and outbound to those plants. And so when we see energy security issues hit at a country level, then the supply chains themselves get disrupted. And so there is a ripple effect in the economy and efficiencies are destroyed, right? So apart from also not being able to grow, you are also losing a lot of efficiency, and a lot of the ability to actually distribute wealth, I think, within the economy as well is affected. So I think that's another interesting perspective to consider, to also think about it from a holistic, everybody that's impacted by the issue of energy security perspective.
And in a way, the most expensive electron is the electron that doesn't exist. I think that's how I think about that.
Yeah, I think I like it. I think I've heard that as well. So more from the energy management side of the thing, when you say that the most expensive kilowatts, the cheapest kilowatt hour is the one that you don't consume. So which is sort of the same rationale. So Rudy, question for you. Now, you clearly have highlighted this problem very well, and we fully understand it. And that's why I wanted us to focus on the business aspect of it. So now the question becomes, how do we solve it within the next 5 years? Because I think sometimes one of the things that frustrates me a lot is that when you go to conferences, you talk to people, we always talk about the potential of Africa. Hey, the potential is not going to build anything. It's about putting things in action, in plans, so that we can actually get moving. So according to you, because you have a lot of insight, you're talking to a lot of people, what is the credible plan, to halve the problem, or is to reduce it significantly within the next 5 years?
Yeah. No, such an important question. And I mean, Tony, this is one I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the past months and years, right? So given that it's such a complex problem that we have, the answer is also quite multifaceted, and there's quite a few things we'll need to get right as a continent to really address this, right? And I'll focus on a few of the key areas. I think it's useful to break it down a bit by the value chain. So if you think about generation, how can we ensure we get the generation capacity that we need? There's going to be a mix of large-scale generation projects that are needed, and there's also the potential for embedded small-scale generation to play a big role, especially in Africa's context. And if you think about it, a lot of the world is facing a energy transition challenge, and they're busy working through it. We, in a way, have the unique opportunity as a continent to get energy right the first time around, almost without having to go through a transition for much of our population. And therefore, the question is, how do we get the right amount of generation capacity online as quickly and affordably as possible? And what we've seen, we've done a lot of analysis as BCG on this. The cheapest source of electricity in Africa, it's just a renewable dominant system, much cheaper than coal, even cheaper than nuclear. And therefore, what's needed is to create the right regulatory and investment environment to enable massive investments in renewable generation and other supporting technologies. So I think the first part of this problem is, how do we ensure that we create the right regulatory environment that attracts large-scale private sector investment into renewable generation? And for that, you need clear regulation that defines how those investments will be remunerated. So what revenue can you generate if you build a renewable power plant? Where do you get that from? How do you get that? And that's going to be critical to make investment flow into generation. But generation is only one part of the challenge. What we also see is there's going to need to be a massive upscaling of transmission and distribution infrastructure across Africa. And this is more relevant for some countries than other, and for some sectors of certain countries than other, because where there are places where it makes sense to just go straight to distributed generation and bypass the need for transmission capacity. But in many areas, it's still going to be a key need for delivering the electricity to the end users. So what we expect is there's a need to really support the investment into transmission and distribution infrastructure by government, because this is still a place where we really believe there's an important role for government to play across many countries, but also by the private sector, which is a new concept for some countries. It is something we've seen being done elsewhere. And to deliver on the scale of investment and growth required in the transmission infrastructure, it's going to be really critical to think through what types of partnerships could exist within the space that enables investment from government, but also from the private sector, from developmental financial institutions. So that's talking a bit about the infrastructure. But beyond the infrastructure, to make it work, you need massive amounts of skills, and skills in a sector that is quite new to Africa, but new to the world. And what we believe is absolutely critical is upskilling and reskilling of the labor force to be able to deliver on the energy needs of the country. So what you see in countries, for example, like Australia, in Australia, because of the amount of skills that are needed in the renewable sector, it's actually competed with those same skills for the mining sector, and the mining sector is stagnating a bit because of running out of affordable individuals who can work in this construction and installation space. So we need to preempt that a bit in Africa, and it has the opportunity to create large amounts of jobs. If you think of South Africa alone, could be between 100 and 300,000 net new jobs created just in the power sector through this energy transition. But it's an aspect of upskilling and reskilling. And then the final key element of this puzzle that I would highlight is the funding. And we spoke a bit about ensuring that the private sector can contribute to the funding. But beyond the private sector, to make any funding flow, you ultimately need healthy projects which have the right regulation in place to ensure that any investment in that project is likely to yield a positive return of the right scale. So it's going to be critical to ensure that, on the one hand, the projects are set up in this way, and on the other hand, the legislation is set up in this way to ensure that you can have legally ring-fenced investable projects with clear business cases, with clear sources of revenue that can allow the money to flow, and where you can go beyond kind of high-level pledges to invest in renewables to actual money being flowing and being invested into specific projects.
That was a very complete answer, because you talked about the regulatory framework, you talked about the infrastructure that is needed, and then you talked about the skills that we need to build for that. You touched on the funding that is absolutely critical. But beyond all of that, you can't do that if there isn't a pipeline of projects to make it happen. Okay, that look like your plan for the the next person who wants to be president. That's okay. So let me just come back to you, Kesh. I think that was a very, very complete answer. I love it, by the way. Thank you for that, Rudy. So you mentioned something, Rudy, that I want Kesh to rebound on. The fact that we may have the opportunity to get things right for first go, which is a big debate at the moment in the continent. Because the other approach is we want to have the luxury of having the problem that other are having, which is tapping into our actual resources that we're having right now, meaning oil and gas and so on and so forth, because the energy access is more pressing than the energy transition. That's what I'm hearing, right? So that's kind of a big debate I'm saying, and definitely that was quite evident as well at the Africa Energy Indaba. So Kesh, I want to ask you, obviously, sustainability is something that you understand very well. Now, from an African point of view, what are for you the top 3 priority for Africa? You know, what do you think the continent should be doing? Because I mentioned to you the little challenge with the different approaches. They can be merged, I know, but I know it's a bit difficult to get it right. But what should be, from sustainability point of view, the 3 priorities for the continent?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Tony, and a complex one to try and answer, right? But I'll give it a shot. I mean, I think first of all, it's important to acknowledge that when we think about a decarbonized / lower carbon future, and then making sure we have energy security and energy access. I don't think those are two conflicting objectives. I actually think that they are quite complementary. So if we think about, what Rudy mentioned earlier, the fact that a renewable dominated system is the cheapest system across, almost all of Africa at the moment. And it's an important thing to realize, right? We've had a point of inflection in the way costs have evolved in the renewable sector over time. And when we say a renewables dominant system, we mean something that can be primarily renewables in terms of installed capacity, but then using other sources of generation to balance the load along the way. We're not saying it's exclusively renewable. So I think that's an important fact to acknowledge. And if you look at the scale of the challenge that's then required to get to that best least cost energy mix that's also driving to a lower carbon future. I mean, just in one country alone, take South Africa, for example, you need a minimum of 3 to 5 gigawatts a year for the next 30 years, right? Now put that into perspective. The country's built what, something like 6 to 7 gigawatts in the last 15. So the scale of the challenge is massive, right? And so being able to orchestrate and coordinate the skills, the infrastructure, the policy that's needed is going to be critical, right? And so I would say the first critical priority is to make sure we have coherent planning and integrated policy. But the underpinning message there is that to get there, you're going to need cooperation. And I think cooperation across different spheres of society, government, industry, civil society, academia, all working together to try and resolve this. So I think that's priority number one, driving collaboration and integrated planning. I think priority number two is to make sure that at the core of this, we have the vision of a just transition, right? And I know that word's been used a lot, right? But I think every country needs to chart that journey for themselves, right? It's not just about creating more jobs than we lose. It's also being able to manage the migration of labor through the economy, making sure, as Rudy says, you can reskill and redeploy people, making sure you can get finance structured the right way to the right parts of the economy, and making sure that use this almost as an opportunity to pivot to a more distributed form of ownership in the economy. I think that's the opportunity for Africa, right? If you think about the nature of renewables and green technology, it is distributed in its nature and therefore represents an opportunity to drive more inclusive industrial growth. So I think making sure that the just transition is at the core of the transition is pillar number two and one of the priorities for African countries. And then pillar number three, I'm going to have to go back to what Rudy mentioned around finance, right? I think the importance of finance here can't be underestimated. Yeah. And it's a sophisticated conversation to have. We typically leave the conversation at how much finance do we need, right? That's one element of the puzzle. But I think the critical thing here is getting the right form of finance. So think about blended finance from the perspective of commercial funding, concessional funding, grant funding, and how that all comes together to fund different projects in the economy. And that's going to require a fundamental rethink of how we price risk in the economy, right? Mm-hmm. And the financial sector in particular, I think there's a massive opportunity here to develop innovative financial solutions, collaborating with development finance institutions across Africa, which we know are active across many countries, to almost spearhead this, right? To become ahead of the curve in what does the future of sustainable finance look like. We have the perfect use case for it here in Africa. We have interested parties on both ends, on the emerging market side and also on the developed economy side. So I think that's a massive opportunity, and a focused intervention around sustainable finance would be the third priority in my perspective. Yeah.
Excellent. So I think, again, like, so those are very, very interesting answer that you're giving. So, okay, you talked about the collaboration and the planning that needs to happen, the concept of just transition, which means many things, but can definitely be refocused, and you talk about the funding. And that's actually the common part between the you two. And talking about funding, because I know obviously we sort of running out of time, but I definitely want to talk to your company because I need more time to talk to you because you have a lot of insight to share here. So a lot of the time, we're also hearing that energy transition is something that is pushed from the West to Africa, right? Especially the notion of ESG. So I just wanted to hear from both of you, I think probably going to finish there, what part ESG is playing is all of that, if it should play at all. And also a subsequent question, like I said, I really have, that's the sense I'm getting. Yeah, I just want to get your opinion that energy transition is clearly a concept being pushed by the West to the continent. Why, and my question to you, why should Africa be interested by the concept of energy transition, and what part does ESG play into that if you can both chip into that, please, that I appreciate.
Yeah, sure. Maybe let me start, and in case you can close up on this. But yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the more developing world, in Africa, but also in Asia, if you look at China, you look at India, it's not only the kind of traditional global north or the Western countries that have been working on the energy transition. So, I mean, China Light and Power, for example, they're planning on basically switching to renewables, decommissioning their coal plants by 2040 and bringing in renewable capacity instead, because it's just cheaper and more affordable to do so once these plants reach the end of their life. If you look at India, very similar thing there, which with big focus on reskilling and re-employing the individuals affected into new renewable jobs. If you look at Brazil, absolutely massive amounts of investment into renewables in the last 20 years, much more than of course, we have done. And if you look at lots of other African countries, South Africa is actually quite behind when it comes to investing in renewables, and Africa is quite behind South America and Asia when it comes to investing in renewables. So it's not just something that the West is doing. And if we think about why that is, it comes back to this point that Kesh and I both mentioned, that it's just cheaper to build a renewable dominant energy system compared to building a fossil fuel dominant energy system. So financially, it just makes sense. And you also mentioned resources. I mean, can we use our resources? I think many people also forget that we have some of the best solar and wind resources in the world here in Africa. So not using those resources would be a big pity as well. And that's part of the reason why it is so much more affordable in most African countries to go straight to renewable generation capacity rather than fossil fuel. It's just cheaper. So I think there's many reasons why it makes sense to do this. And yeah, and none of them are dependent on the role kind of the West has in this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that, Kesh.
Fully agree, Rudy. I mean, I think also just it's important to clarify as well. We're not saying switch off all fossil fuels overnight as well, right? We're saying there's a transition towards it, and there's, as I explained earlier, fossil fuels could potentially have a role also in balancing the system until new green technologies become viable for that long duration storage problem that needs to be solved. So we're not saying switch it off overnight, but we're saying the direction of the march definitely is towards this renewable dominated system. Now, I think the key question here, and I would rephrase a bit the question you posed to us, Tony. I think the key thing to try and figure out is, how do you put forward the right level of ambition from a decarbonization and speed of decarbonization perspective relative to the socioeconomic impact that has in a country, right? That's the key trade-off that you need to make, right? And we're saying every country needs to actively think about that, because the answer is going to be different depending on the context. There's different starting points, different socioeconomic contexts, different accesses to technology, etc. So I think that's really the trade-off that Africa needs to think about, because if we can get that trade-off right, we can't look back and say the status quo is working, right? I mean, I think we can all agree with that. So I think if we can get that right, we can actually unlock this opportunity that we mentioned, right? And really pivot towards Africa really becoming a green energy hub for the rest of the world, given the great wind and solar resources that Rudy mentioned, but also ample land. I mean, think about Europe and think about the land constraint that they have and the scale of renewables needed. That is a huge value proposition for us. And so I think if we get that balance right and have a very intricate answer at a sort of country level and even sometimes at a regional level, that's really the key focus area that I think countries should think about.
And in a couple of words, and what about ESG? What do you think ESG can play a role into that?
Yeah, so I think ESG creates it creates a framework, right? Okay. That allows you to interpret, all of the different complexities that are kind of happening in the space, be it the cost of transitioning, the socioeconomic cost of transitioning, and then the reporting structures that effectively allow you to get transparency on what companies and individuals are doing. So it is a tool to help that journey along its way. I would say it's not an end goal, but it's really a tool to try and enable you to get to the point of a just transition to a low carbon future.
Excellent. That's great. Well, listen, I think you've sort of removed my frustration now. Now that I've had that interview, I can carry and do that in peace. So it was great to have you today. So speaking to you, getting some insight into what you think about the energy sector in the continent, looking at all the different challenges and also the response that you've provided. I'm very pleased with what I've heard and encouraged that although things are challenging, definitely there is a way forward. And if we come together and we collaborate and we make good use of our resources, I'm sure the continent should be in a much better place in the next 5 to 10 years. So Kesh and Rudy, so thank you very much for this time with me. And I'm looking forward to see you maybe at a next event or who knows, maybe for coffee or tea. Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for having us.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tony. Cheers.